The first efforts toward an elaboration of a TMW. From a purely scientific point of view, a full-fledged and complete theory of a multipolar world, TMW, does not exist today. We will not find it among the classic theories and paradigms of international relations, IR. We will also search the newest post-positivist theories in vain. It is not fully elaborated even in the most flexible and synthetic domain in the sphere of geopolitical studies, where much is often comprehended that in IR remains outside the frame or is interpreted too unfairly. Nevertheless, more and more works devoted to foreign policy, global politics, geopolitics, and international relations proper are dedicated to the topic of multipolarity. A growing number of authors try to comprehend and describe multipolarity as a model, phenomenon, precedent, or possibility. The themes of multipolarity, in one way or another, were touched on in the works of David Kampf, in his essay Emergence of a Multipolar World, the Yale historian Paul Kennedy, in the book The Rise and Fall of the Great Empires, the geopolitician Dale Walton, in the book Geopolitics and the Great Powers in the 21st Century, Multipolarity and the Revolution in Strategic Perspective, the American political scientist Delineation, in the book After Empire, The Birth of a Multipolar World, and others. In our opinion, the British IR specialist Fabio Petito came closest to understanding the essence of multipolarity. Petito tried to build a serious and well-grounded alternative to the unipolar world on the basis of the legal and philosophical concepts of Carl Schmitt. Political actors and influential journalists time and again mention the multipolar world order in their speeches and writings. Thus, former U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, who was the first to call the U.S. the indispensable nation, announced on February 2, 2000 that the U.S. does not want to establish and enforce a unipolar world and that economic integration has already created a certain world, which can even be called multipolar. On January 26, 2007, a New York Times editorial spoke directly of the emergence of a multipolar world, together with China, which takes a parallel place at the table along with other centers of power, like Brussels or Tokyo. A 2008 U.S. National Intelligence Council report on Global Tendencies 2025 declares that the rise of a global multipolar system should be expected over the next 2 decades. In 2009, many considered U.S. President Barack Obama a harbinger of the era of multipolarity, thinking that he would give priority in American foreign policy to growing centers of power, like Brazil, China, India, and Russia. On July 22, 2009, Vice President Joe Biden announced during a visit to Ukraine that the U.S. will try to build a multipolar world. And yet, in all these books, articles, and pronouncements, there is no precise definition of what a multipolar world, MW, is, nor, all the more so, any sort of systematic and consistent theory of its construction, TMW. Most often, appeal to multipolarity implies only an indication that at present, in the process of globalization, in the undisputed center and core of the modern world, the US, Europe, and, more broadly, the global West, certain competitors appear on the horizon, rapidly developing, or simply powerful regional states and blocks of states, belonging to the Second World. Comparison of the potentials of the US and Europe, on one hand, and the growing new centers of power, China, India, Russia, the countries of Latin America, etc., on the other, convinces more and more of the relativity of the traditional superiority of the West and raises new questions about the logic of the long-term processes determining the global architecture of powers on a planetary scale, in politics, economics, energy, demography, culture, etc. All of these common but do not at all compensate for its absence. They should be taken into account in the construction of such a theory, however, it should be noted that they are fragments and sketches and fail to rise to the level of even primary theoretical, conceptual generalizations. Nevertheless, appeal to a multipolar world order can be heard more and more often at official summits, international conferences, and congresses. References to multipolarity are present in a number of important international agreements and in the texts of the conceptions of the national security and defense strategies of many influential, powerful countries, China, Russia, Iran, and in part the European Union. Thus, today as never before, it is necessary to take a step toward beginning the full-fledged elaboration of a theory of a multipolar world in accordance with the basic demands of an academic, scientific approach. Multipolarity is not congruent with the national, Westphalian model of organizing the world. We proceed with the construction of a theory of a multipolar world, TMW. In earnest, we should strictly delineate the studied conceptual zone. For this, we shall consider the basic concepts and determine the forms of global order that are definitely not multipolar and, accordingly, in regards to which multipolarity is an alternative. We begin with the Westphalian system, which recognizes the absolute sovereignty of the nation-state and builds on this basis the entire legal field of international relations. This system, formed after 1648, the end of the 30 Years' War in Europe, went through a few stages of its establishment and to one extent or another corresponded to objective reality until the end of the Second World War. This system was born of the rejection of the pretensions of medieval empires to universalism and a divine mission, corresponded to bourgeois reforms in European societies, and was based on the position that the highest sovereignty is possessed only by the nation-state, while there is no authority outside it with legal right to interfere in the internal politics of the state, whatever its goals and missions, religious, political, or otherwise. From the middle of the 17th century to the middle of the 20th century, this principle determined European politics and was transferred with certain modifications to the countries of the rest of the world. The Westphalian system originally concerned only European states, while their colonies were regarded merely as their extensions, lacking sufficient political and economic potential to claim independent sovereignty. From the start of the 20th century and during the course of decolonialization, that same Westphalian principle was spread throughout former colonies. The Westphalian model supposes full legal equality among sovereign states. In this model, the world has as many poles of foreign policy decision-making as there are sovereign states. This rule implicitly acts even now by inertia, and all international law is based on it. But in practice, of course, there is inequality and hierarchical subordination among sovereign states. In the First and Second World Wars, the distribution of powers among the largest global powers spilled over into the confrontation of separate blocs, where decisions were made in the country that was most powerful among its allies. As a result of the Second World War, in consequence of the defeat of Nazi Germany and the Axis countries, a bipolar world system of international relations formed in the global system, called the Yalta system. De jure international law continued to recognize the absolute sovereignty of any nation-state. De facto, however, the major decisions concerning the central questions of the world order and global politics were made in only two centers, Washington and Moscow. A multipolar world differs from the classical Westphalian system in that it does recognize in separate nation-states, legally and formally sovereign, the status of full-fledged poles. As a result, the number of poles in a multipolar world should be significantly less than the number of recognized, and unrecognized, nation-states. Today, the great majority of these states cannot by themselves ensure their own security or prosperity in the face of a theoretically possible conflict with the hegemon, the role of which, in our world, is played by the U.S. Consequently, they are politically and economically dependent on external sources. Being dependent, they cannot be centers of real independent and sovereign will in global questions of world order. Multipolarity is not a system of international relations that insists on the legal equality of nation-states, considered as matter of fact. That is only a facade of an entirely different picture of the world, based on the real, not the nominal, balance of powers and strategic potentials. Multipolarity operates with the state of affairs that exists not only de jure, but de facto, and it starts from the principal inequality of nation-states in the contemporary and empirically fixed world. Fixed world. Moreover, the structure of this inequality is such that secondary and tertiary powers are not able to defend their sovereignty, even in bloc configuration, against a possible external challenge from a hegemonic power. Hence, this sovereignty is today a legal fiction. Number 2 in production. Multipolarity is not bipolarity. After the Second World War, a bipolar system formed in the world, also called the Yalta system. Formally, it continued to insist on the principle of the absolute sovereignty of all states, and the UN was organized on this principle, continuing the business of the League of Nations. However, in practice there emerged two centers of global decision-making, the US and the USSR. The US and the USSR represented two alternative political and economic systems, global capitalism and global socialism. Thus, strategic bipolarity rested on ideological dualism, liberalism versus Marxism. The bipolar world was based on the economic and military strategic parity of the US and USSR, on the symmetrical comparability of the potential of each of the opposed camps. At the same time, no other country in either camp was even remotely comparable in power to Moscow or Washington. Consequently, there were two hegemons on a global scale, which were surrounded by constellations of allied countries, strategically half-vassals. In this model, the national sovereignty of countries, formally recognized, gradually lost its significance. In the first place, every country depended on the global policies of the hegemon to whose sphere of influence it related. So, they were not independent, and regional conflicts, as a rule, in the Third World, quickly grew into the confrontation of the two superpowers, which tried to redistribute the balance of planetary influence to disputed territories. This explains the conflicts in Korea, Vietnam, Angola, Afghanistan, etc. In the bipolar world, there was also a third power, the non-aligned movement. It included a few countries of the Third World that refused to make an unambiguous choice in favor of either capitalism or socialism and preferred to maneuver between the global antagonistic interests of the US and USSR. Some were able to do this to a certain extent, but the very possibility of non-alignment presupposed the presence of precisely two poles, which to one extent or another counterbalanced each other. At the same time, most non-aligned countries were in no way able to form a third pole since they were isolated, lacking consolidation and a shared socio-economic platform, and inferior in the main respects to the superpowers. The entire world was divided into the capitalist West, the First World, the West, the Socialist East, the Second World, and the rest, the Third World. What's more, the rest was in every sense a global periphery, where the interests of the superpowers occasionally came into conflict. Conflict between the superpowers themselves was almost entirely out of the question because of parity, because of mutually assured nuclear destruction. Countries of the periphery, Asia, Africa, Latin America, formed the intermediate zone for the partial reconsideration of the balance of powers. After the collapse of one of the two poles, the fall of the USSR in 1991, the bipolar system ended. This produced the preconditions for the emergence of an alternative world order. Many analysts and specialists in IR correctly started to speak about the end of the Yalta system. Recognizing de jure sovereignty, de facto the Yalta world was built on the principle of the balance of two symmetrical and relatively balanced hegemons. With the exit from the historical arena of one of the hegemons, the entire system ceased to exist. The time of the unipolar world order, or unipolar moment, had come. The multipolar world is not a bipolar world, as we knew it in the second half of the 20th century, since today there is no power able by itself to strategically oppose the might of the US and the NATO countries, and, moreover, no general and clear ideology capable of rallying a significant part of humanity to strict ideational opposition against the ideology of liberal democracy, capitalism, and human rights, on which the new, this time sole hegemony of the US rests. Neither contemporary Russia, nor China, nor India, nor any other state can, under current circumstances, lay claim by itself to the status of a second pole. The re-establishment of bipolarity is impossible ideologically, the end of the broad appeal of Marxism, and in terms of the strategic potential and accumulated military technological resources. For the last 30 years, the US and NATO have pulled so far ahead that no country is capable of symmetrical competition with them militarily, strategically, economically, or technically. Number 3 in production. Multipolarity is incompatible with a unipolar world. The collapse of the USSR meant at the same time the disappearance both of a powerful, symmetrical superpower and of an entire gigantic ideological camp. This was the end of one of the two global hegemons. The whole structure of the world order from this moment on changed irreversibly and substantially. At the same time, the remaining pole, led by the US and based on liberal democratic capitalist ideology, was preserved as a phenomenon and continued to expand its socio-political system, democracy, the market, the ideology of human rights, on a global scale. This is what is called the unipolar world, the unipolar world order. In such a world, there is a single center of decision-making concerning the fundamental global questions. The West and its core, the Euro-Atlantic community led by the US, found itself in the role of the sole remaining hegemon. Under such circumstances, the entire space of the planet represents a threefold regionalization, described in the neo-Marxist theory of Wallerstein: the area of the core, the rich north, the center, the area of the global periphery, the poor south, the periphery, and the intermediate area, the semi-periphery, including the big countries rapidly developing capitalistically, China, India, Brazil, a few countries of the Pacific Ocean region, and also Russia, which preserved by inertia a significant strategic, economic, and energy potential. In the 1990s, the unipolar world seemed to be a reality settled once and for all, and some American analysts pronounced on this basis the thesis of the end of history, Fukuyama. This thesis meant that the world is becoming entirely unipolar ideologically, politically, economically, and socially, and that henceforth all processes occurring in it would be not a historical drama, based on the battle of ideas and interests, but the economic, and relatively peaceful, competition of economic subjects, analogous to the way in which the domestic politics of free, democratic, liberal regimes runs. Democracy becomes global. On the planet there is only the West and its outskirts, i.e. the countries gradually integrating into it. The clearest formulation of the theory of unipolarity was offered by American neoconservatives, who emphasized the role of the US in the new global world order, sometimes openly pronouncing America a new empire, Kaplan, or beneficent global hegemony, Crystal, Kagan, and foreseeing the onset of an American century, project for a new American century. Among neoconservatives, unipolarity acquired a theoretical foundation. The future world order was seen as an America-centric construction, where the core was the US in the role of the global arbiter and embodiment of the principles of freedom and democracy, and around this center constellations of other countries are structured, reproducing the American model with varying degrees of precision. They differ according to geography and the extent of their similarity to the US, the near circle the countries of Europe and Japan, next, the rapidly developing liberal countries of Asia, then everyone else. All of the belts around global America in various orbits are included in the processes of democratization and Americanization. The spread of American values occurs alongside the realization of practical American interests and expansion of the area of direct American control on a global scale. On a strategic level, unipolarity is expressed in the central role of the US in NATO and, in turn, in the asymmetrical superiority of the combined military potential of NATO over all other world powers. At the same time, the West outdoes other non-Western countries in economic potential, technological development, etc. And the most important thing, precisely the West is the matrix in which the system of values and norms that are today considered a universal standard for all other countries in the world historically formed and was consolidated. We can call this global intellectual hegemony, WHI. We can call this global intellectual hegemony, which, on one hand, serves the technical infrastructure of global control and, on the other, stands at the center of the dominant planetary paradigm. Material hegemony goes hand in hand with spiritual, intellectual, cognitive, cultural, informational hegemony. In principle, the American political elite rules precisely in such a consciously hegemonic manner. However, the neoconservatives speak about this openly and transparently, while representatives of other political and ideational tendencies prefer more indirect expressions. Even critics of the unipolar world in the US itself do not call into question the universality of American values and the striving to assert them on a global scale. Objections focus on the question of how realistic this project is in the middle to long-term perspective and whether the US will be able by itself to carry the burden of a global empire. The problems on the path to such a direct open American domination, which seemed to be a realized fact in the 1990s, led some American analysts, including Krothamer, who introduced the term, to speak of the end of the unipolar moment. But despite everything, precisely unipolarity in one or another form, open or concealed, is the model of world order that became reality after 1991 and remains so even today. Number 4. Introduction. Bipolarity is accompanied in practice by the nominal preservation of the Westphalian system and with the inertial remnants of the bipolar world. As before, the sovereignty of all nation-states is recognized de jure. The UN Security Council partially still reflects the balance of powers corresponding to the realities of the Cold War. Accordingly, American unipolar hegemony de facto exists simultaneously with a number of international institutions expressing the balance of power of other eras and cycles in the history of international relations. The contradictions between the de facto and de jure states of affairs constantly make themselves known, in part in the acts of direct intervention by the US or Western coalitions in sovereign states, sometimes bypassing Security Council vetoes of similar acts. In such cases, as the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, we also see an example of the unilateral violation of the principle of the sovereignty of independent states, ignoring the Westphalian model, and refusal to take into account Russia's position, Putin's position, in the UN Security Council, and even Washington's inattention toward the protests of European NATO partners, Chirac in France, Schroeder in Germany. The most consistent supporters of unipolarity, for instance, Republican John McCain, insist on establishing a world order that corresponds to the real balance of power. They suggest the creation, in place of the UN, of a different model, a League of Democracies, in which the dominant positions of the US, i.e., unipolarity, would be secured legally. Such a project of the legalization in the structure of international relations of a unipolar world and the hegemonic status of the American empire is one of the possible directions of evolution of the global political system. It is entirely obvious that a multipolar world order does not simply differ from a unipolar one but is its direct antithesis. Unipolarity proposes one hegemon and one center of decision-making. Multipolarity insists on several centers, such that none has the exclusive right and must take into account the positions of the others. Multipolarity is thus a direct logical alternative to unipolarity. There can be no compromise between them. According to the rules of logic, the world is either unipolar or multipolar. At the same time, what matters is not how one or another model is legally formulated, but how it is de facto. In the Cold War, diplomats and politicians reluctantly acknowledged bipolarity, which was nevertheless an obvious fact. So, we should distinguish between diplomatic language and concrete reality. Today's world order is in fact arranged as a unipolar world. We can only argue about whether this is good or bad, whether it is daybreak or sundown, whether it will last long or end quickly, but the fact remains a fact. We live in a unipolar world. The unipolar moment continues, although some analysts assert that it is already coming to an end. Number 5. The multipolar world is not nonpolar. American critics of strict unipolarity, and especially the ideological rivals of the neoconservatives centered in the Council on Foreign Relations, proposed a different term instead of unipolarity, nonpolarity. This concept is built on the idea that processes of globalization will develop even further, and the Western model of world order will broaden its presence to all countries and peoples of the world. In this way, the intellectual and value hegemony of the West will continue. The global world will be a world of liberalism, democracy, the free market, and human rights. But the role of the US as a national power and leader of globalization will, according to supporters of this theory, be reduced. Instead of direct American hegemony, the model of global governance will take shape, in which will participate the representatives of various countries in solidarity with the general values and moving toward the establishment of a single socio-political space worldwide. We are dealing here again with an analog to the end of history, Fukuyama, only described in other terms. The nonpolar world will be based implicitly on the cooperation of democratic countries. But gradually, in the process of establishment, other non-state actors should be included: NGOs, social movements, separate civil groups, network societies, etc. The major practice in the establishment of a nonpolar world is scattering the level of decision-making from one authority, today, Washington, to many on a lower level, right up to online planetary referenda concerning important events and the actions of all humanity. Economics replaces politics, and market competition sweeps aside all national borders. Security is transformed from a state matter to a matter for citizens themselves. The era of global democracy sets in. In its general features, this theory agrees with globalization and is thought of as a stage that must replace the unipolar world. But only under the condition that the socio-political, value-based, technological, and economic model, liberal democracy, advanced today by the US and the West, will become a universal phenomenon, and the need for a strong defense of democratic and liberal ideals by the US will fall away. All regimes opposing the West, democratization and Americanization will be destroyed before the onset of the nonpolar world. The elites of all countries should be homogeneously capitalistic, liberal, and democratic, in a word, Western, regardless of their historical, geographic, religious, and national origin. The project of a nonpolar world is supported by many very influential political and financial groups, from the Rothschilds to Soros and his fund. The project of a nonpolar world is directed toward the future. It is thought of as the global formation that should replace unipolarity, as that which follows it. It is not so much an alternative as a continuation. And this continuation becomes possible only to the extent that the center of gravity in society will shift from today's combination of the alliance of two levels of hegemony: material, the American military-industrial complex, the Western economy and resources, and spiritual, norms, procedures, values, to a purely intellectual hegemony, while the significance of material domination will gradually abate. This is the global information society, where the main governance will develop in the sphere of reason, through rule over intellects, control over consciousness, and the programming of a virtual world. The unipolar world in no way coincides with the project of a nonpolar world, since it accepts neither the validity of the unipolar moment as a prelude to a future world order, nor the intellectual hegemony of the West, nor the universality of its values, nor the diffusion of the level of decision-making onto a planetary multitude, without taking into account their cultural and civilizational identities. The nonpolar world proposes that the American model of the melting pot be spread throughout the world as a prelude to a future world order. Nor the intellectual hegemony of the West, nor the universality of its values, nor the diffusion of the level of decision-making onto a planetary multitude, without taking into account their cultural and civilizational identities. The nonpolar world proposes that the American model of the melting pot be spread throughout the world. As a result, all differences between peoples and nations will be erased, and individualized, atomized humanity will become a cosmopolitan civil society without borders. Multipolarity thinks that the centers of decision-making should remain on a rather high level, but not in one place, as today in a unipolar world, and that the cultural peculiarities of each concrete civilization should be preserved and strengthened, not dissolved into a single cosmopolitan multitude. Finley in this book: multipolarity is not multilateralism. Another model of world order, distancing itself somewhat from direct American hegemony, is multilateralism. This concept is widespread in the American Democratic Party. Formally, President Barack Obama followed precisely this model in his foreign policy. In the context of American foreign policy debates, this approach contrasts with the unipolarity insisted on by neoconservatives. Multilateralism means in practice that the U.S. should not act in the domain of international relations wholly and fully, relying solely on its own forces and informing all its allies and vassals in an imperialistic manner. Instead, Washington should take into account the positions of its partners, argue for and convince others of decisions in dialogue with them, attract them to its side with rational conclusions and sometimes compromises. In such a case, the U.S. should be first among equals, not a dictator among subordinates. This obligates the U.S. to its allies in certain ways in foreign policy and demands submission to a shared strategy. This general strategy is in the current case the strategy of the West to establish a global democracy, market, and the implementation of the ideology of human rights on a planetary scale. But in this process, the U.S., as leader, should not directly equate its national interests with the universal values of Western civilization, in whose name it acts. In certain cases it is preferable to act in a coalition, and sometimes even to concede something to partners. Multilateralism differs from unipolarity in that the emphasis is placed here on the West as a whole, and especially on its value, i.e. normative, aspect. In this respect, the apologists for multilateralism resemble those who support a nonpolar world. The difference between multilateralism and nonpolarity consists only in the fact that multilateralism emphasizes coordination among democratic Western countries, while nonpolarity includes as actors also non-state players, NGOs, networks, social movements, etc. It is significant that in practice Obama's multilateral policies, announced by him and by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, differed little from the direct and transparent imperialism of George W. Bush, in whose administration the neoconservatives dominated. U.S. military interventions continue, Libya, and American troops kept their presence in occupied Afghanistan and Iraq. A multipolar world does not coincide with a multilateral world order, since it does not agree to the universalism of Western values and does not recognize the right of countries of the rich North neither alone nor collectively to act in the name of all humanity and to act, even compositely, as the sole center of decision-making concerning the most significant questions. So now summary in this party in the book delineating the meaning of the concept of multipolarity through a chain of juxtaposed or alternative terms outlines the semantic field in which we will have to proceed to build our theory of multipolarity. Until now, we have spoken only of what multipolarity is not. These negations and distinctions allow us to distinguish by contrast a number of constitutive and rather positive characteristics. If we summarize the second, positive part, emerging from the series of differentiations we made, we get approximately the following picture. The multipolar world is a radical alternative to the unipolar world, existing in fact today, in that it insists on the presence of several independent and sovereign centers of global. 1. The multipolar world is a radical alternative to the unipolar world, existing in fact today, in that it insists on the presence of several independent and sovereign centers of global, strategic decision-making on a planetary level. 2. These centers should be sufficiently equipped and independent materially to have the possibility to defend their sovereignty on a material level in the face of the invasion of a probable enemy, as a model of which we can take the most powerful force in the world today. This demand amounts to the possibility to oppose the material, military, strategic hegemony of the US and NATO. 3. These centers of decision-making are not obligated to recognize as a sine qua non Western norms and values, democracy, liberalism, the free market, parliamentarism, human rights, individualism, cosmopolitanism, etc., and can be entirely independent of the spiritual hegemony of the West. 4. The multipolar world does not propose a return to a bipolar system, since today there exists neither strategically nor ideologically a force capable of opposing alone the material and spiritual hegemony of the contemporary West and its leader, the US. There must be more than two poles in a multipolar world. 5. The multipolar world does not consider serious the sovereignty of existing nation-states, so long as it is declared on a purely legal level and is not confirmed by the presence of sufficient military, strategic, economic, and political potential. To be a sovereign subject in the 21st century, the nation-state is no longer enough. Under these circumstances, only an aggregate or coalition of states can have real sovereignty. The Westphalian system, continuing to exist de jure, no longer reflects the real system of international relations and should be reconsidered. 6. Multipolarity is irreducible to nonpolarity and to multilateralism, since it does not locate the center of decision-making, pole, in the authority of a world government, nor in the club of the US and its democratic allies, the global West, nor in the supranational level of networks, NGOs, and other civil society actors. A pole must be located somewhere else. These 6 points set the stage for further elaborations and conceptually embody the main features of multipolarity. However, this description, although it substantially advances our understanding of the essence of multipolarity, is not yet enough to claim the status of a theory. It is a first step, with which full-fledged theorization only begins. Today there is no ready theory of a multipolar world in any of the available paradigms of international relations, nor, all the more so, is there even a place reserved for such a theory. For a long time, the field of international relations was considered an American science, since it developed primarily in the US. But in recent decades it has become studied more widely in scientific establishments and institutions worldwide. However, the discipline still carries a clear mark of West-centrism. It was developed in Western countries in the era of modernity and preserves historical and geographical ties with the context in which it originally arose and where it was established. This is expressed in particular in the main axis of debates, around which IR formed as a discipline, realists versus liberals, which reflected the specific nature of the particular worries and problems of precisely American foreign policy, repeating in certain ways the classic US argument between isolationists and expansionists. In the latest phase, and especially in the sphere of post-positivist approaches, tendencies have clearly arisen of relativizing Americacentrism, West-centrism generally. Impulses toward the democratization of theories and methods, the broadening of criteria, and the more uniform spread of actors in IR have made themselves known, as has a more attentive, thick, analysis of their semantic structures and identities. This is a step towards the relativization of Western epistemic hegemony. But to the present even the critique of Western hegemony has proceeded according to the laws of that very hegemony. Thus, typical Western concepts of democracy and democratization, freedom and equality, are transferred to non-Western societies and are sometimes even opposed to the West, as though these concepts are something universal. If opposition to the West proceeds under the banners of the universalism of Western values, this opposition is doomed to be sterile. Thus, in order to leave the borders of West-centric civilization, it is necessary to stand at a distance from all its theoretical concepts and methodological strategies, even those that comprise critique of the West. In reality, an alternative model of IR and, accordingly, an alternative structure of world order can take shape only in opposition to the entire spectrum of Western theories in IR, in the first place positivist, but in part also post-positivist ones. The absence among the IR theorists, who we have considered, of a theory of a multipolar world, TMW, proves to be not an annoying accident or sign of neglect, but an entirely law-like fact. It simply cannot exist in this context, somehow or other encoded with the attitudes of Western cognitive, epistemological, hegemony. Nevertheless, theoretically it can full well be constructed. And taking account of the broad panorama of existing IR theories will only help to formulate it correctly. If we seriously start building such a theory and take a distance at the outset from the cognitive hegemony of the West in the sphere of IR, that is, if we call into question the existing spectrum of IR theories as an axiomatic base, then at the second stage we can borrow separate elements from that sphere, each time stipulating in detail on what terms and in what context we do this. No existing IR theory, strictly speaking, is relevant for the construction of a theory of a multipolar world. But many of them contain elements that, on the contrary, can well be integrated into a TMW under certain circumstances.